Citizen Sleeper feels, at first, like a remarkably aimless game. This lies primarily in its atmosphere and general structure, but this also extends to the player character. In the game's universe, it's illegal to create a sentient AI, but there's a loophole to this law by copying already sentient human minds and pasting them into biosynthetic bodies. That's where you come in. One of the many titular sleepers, sentient biomechanical creatures created by a megacorporation to be used for cheap labor. But you've escaped. The game's opening moments center on you going through the agonizing process of waking up after having drifted in space to reach your current location. A grungy, dull space station called the Eye. Your bizarre simulacrum of human senses start to give your consciousness data. You recount the terrible escape you and the others had attempted, even though you seem to be the only one to have made it out. And now that you're free, you can finally set out well, you're free now. What do you want to do? The second failsafe is that you're hardware, and the company would never let their hardware act fully autonomously. You require regular injections of what's called stabilizer, since, while you're a largely cybernetic being, you have certain biological organs within you, and if you don't get doses of the stabilizer, your body will reject those organs, killing you in the process. So there's your core drives. Stay fed, avoid the bounty hunter, and keep your body maintained. But that's just to stay alive. How do you actually want to live? Do you want a cushy job? A ticket off of this station? Some friends? Do you want to embrace your synthetic nature and ascend to a new level of existence? Regardless of your answer, you're inevitably going to wind up encountering the storylines of the other folks living their lives out on the Eye. These people are the core of the game's aimless tone. Sure, they have goals and things they want to do, but with one pretty notable exception, they're not heroes or representatives of some goal or agenda. They're just people living their lives. One man just wants to make good food and trade some stories with the travelers. Another wants freedom from the debt that's trapped them. Another is trying to maintain a sort of order in her home. Aside from our one exception from before and the characters added by the DLC, the most ambition you're going to see from these people is just making their lives a little bit better one day at a time. I know it's pretty obvious, but just in case, spoilers. In particular, we're going to be talking about the storyline of the dockyard worker and his daughter, Lem and Mina, as well as Akira, the stranded mercenary. Getting into these two is also going to require talking about one of the game's multiple endings. Now, your experience through these quests may differ slightly, especially in regards to that one ending, but be aware that the lion's share of these stories are going to get talked over here. But, with that out of the way, this is Citizen Sleeper.
A new royal heather, ivory herb.
The Eye is a large wheel, with some spokes that lead to a middle section, though most of the station is inaccessible to you at first. To get from the shipyards to Lowtown, which is the major residential area, you need to pay a fee to the local gangs. To get from Lowtown to the major spacer hub up in the middle of the station requires exploring the spokes that lead there. Similar idea with the Greenway and the Wastes. The areas are separated until you open them up. You get it, you've played a video game. At the beginning, though, you only have access to the docks, and an early source of work therein is the shipyard. Except the shipyard already has more workers than it needs. So you grind your way into the good graces of the people running the place by being a very good boy, and suddenly they give you a spot on the crew. Here, you meet Lem and his daughter Mina. In their first event, you run into Lem and he starts talking to you, in part to be friendly, but also in part to gush about the ship you two are building. All while Mina stares at you on account of you being a weird-ass robot. Lem wistfully tells you that the ship you just signed on to build is called the Sidereal Horizon. It's a ship commissioned by a company called the Celis Foundation to colonize a world named Celis 1. The first in what the company likely hopes will be a long line of company planets. Now, the pay building that ship is not great, but the company's pitch isn't centered around the money. Now, the ship's colonists have already been selected, but they're going to be in a cozy cryosleep for like a decade or so on the way to Celis 1, and a decade is a really long time, so someone is gonna have to do all the grunt work of maintaining that ship. So, upon the ship's completion, there's gonna be a lottery. Some folks are gonna get their names drawn, and they're gonna get to suffer a long ship ride of work before arriving on a fresh frontier to settle. For the folks building the ship, it's not a glorious way out, but the romantic promise of a whole untouched planet sounds perfect to Lem. He talks sentimentally about how beautiful the simple pleasure of rain is, or of actually seeing night and day as opposed to the permanent void outside the eye. It's a future he wants for his daughter, and while the station isn't exactly a hellhole, it's a particular kind of dreary that a child shouldn't have to live in. Mina is a lot of his drive. In fact, he mentions that his biggest problem right now is finding someone who can babysit her while he takes as many shifts as possible to secure his spot in the lottery, since you have to be an actual member of the crew to have a chance. He asks you to babysit her, since she seems to think the robot man is at least kind of neat, and in all your interactions so far, you've been a pretty stand-up person. Now, whenever he talks about the promise of the side reel and of getting on that ship to the colony world, he'll usually ask how you feel about the prospect, and you never have to confirm you want to go. Lem never stops assuming you'd want to, of course. He seems to view it as too idyllic not to want. However, you may decide that you really do want to get on that ship, and that the fastest way to do so is to make sure it gets done as soon as possible. Every shift you spend at the shipyard contributes little by little towards the ship finally being ready to launch, and if you'd rather do that than babysit for Lem, then there's nothing that can stop you. Except for having a heart, of course. Lem's as earnest as they come. He's remarkably optimistic for the station he lives on, and he seems to be at least something of an exception to that usual aimless feel, since he's got a clear goal and a very clear end game in mind. Keep in mind as well that Lem is met in the shipyard when the player probably doesn't have many friends. At least I know I didn't in my playthrough. Now, the choice of whether or not to help him, or even to involve yourself in this quest, is, of course, yours. But Lem's hope for his future comes through so strongly in the writing that I, at least, found it hard not to be invested. So, I babysat Mina. The girl clearly had attachment issues, and while your mileage may vary, my sleeper didn't really know how to deal with people in a direct way. Much less when that person was a small child perpetually at risk of throwing a tantrum, and throw a tantrum she did. She'd freak out for as long as her dad was gone and sap my energy whenever I babysat her. At least most of the time. See, most of the actions you can take in Citizen Sleeper have negative, neutral, and positive outcomes. And while most of my results were negative, the aforementioned tantrums, the neutral ones were the most interesting. In those, we'd just walk around the neighborhood and I'd get a look at her home. The station isn't an evil or a cruel place. It's not a hellhole or as crime-ridden as a Mos Eisley-style space den. But it's not a place of much hope either. Most people there were passing through or getting away from something. The station itself wasn't in great shape, since apparently many of its systems tend towards the tumultuous, and also there's a big fucking hole in the side of it. But it was her home. This made Lem's point for him. There needed to be something better out there for this kid, and if the sidereal horizon gave him a chance, then he needed to take it. As I babysat Mina whenever time permitted me, Lem eventually got in the shifts he needed, and we had another chat. Progressing a person's story in Citizen Sleeper is rarely a particularly jovial affair. It's not like a moment of stalwart companionship as much as a brief break in the general loneliness. And it feels like that's a mutual thing for Lem. Here, exhausted from his shifts working on the ship and happy to see that you and Mina are getting along well enough, he talks to you about the abandonment issues that made the earlier babysitting so difficult. Mina is actually Lem's adoptive daughter. Once, she and her folks were fleeing from their old homes, and on their way out, one of the ships started to malfunction. It started losing atmosphere, and everybody inside died. Except for Mina. Her folks had found a weapons locker that sealed itself off from the outside environment. She was small enough to fit, and so she did. Lem was working for a PMC around this time and stumbled across that ship, presumably not long after everyone but Mina had died. As he tells it, the cold would have gotten to her before long. He makes special mention of her lips having turned blue. Then, when he went to hand her off to the paramedics, she didn't let go of him. And so he stuck with her. It was immediately apparent that his daughter was everything to him, but having him directly state it after you've gone out of your way to watch her for no apparent material gain makes the statement more powerful than a simple thank you. It also starts feeling a lot more inclusive when he starts talking about the life he wants on the horizon, because it seems like he's starting to expect you'll be a part of it. This means that the way forward is obvious. It's time to build the spaceship. Building the ship is a long-ass process on account of it being an entire fucking spaceship, but the enormity of the process gives you some much-needed wiggle room in the middle of all this. For instance, you're probably gonna need another source of income. Working on the horizon pays 15 cryo per shift. That's about enough for a meal. Unfortunately, the stabilizers that you need every so often so that you don't fucking die are about 100 cryo. Between those two absolute necessities and the wants of other quests, it's more than likely that the side reel becomes sort of a side gig for most players, especially those who are still disinterested in personally taking it off the eye. Regardless, work progresses, the ship gets built, eventually, the corporation calls everyone in for that lottery. The mood is immediately pretty tense since everyone has a lot riding on this. But then the video starts. And unfortunately, it opens with corporate dribble. Blah blah blah, thank you on behalf of Celis, blah blah blah, all of us here are truly pioneers of a sort. It's just uninspired bullshit. And everybody present seems annoyingly aware of it. In a moment of absolute perfect parody, they even managed to slip the word innovative in there once or twice. Eventually, though, they get to the actual lottery and the crowd starts to pay attention. The voice makes sure we know that the lottery was conducted at complete random by a bunch of AIs. And those who were randomly chosen by those AIs to win the lottery will be called up by their Celis identification numbers. Someone's number gets called, someone at the front whoops and hollers, and at first, one may pause for just a moment and wonder if the game simply didn't bother to give you your character's ID number in the same way that it doesn't need to tell you that you chew your food, but no, it's both simpler and more obvious than that. You didn't get one. None of your lot did. You look at Lem looks at you, and the crowd all look around similarly. Not a working class soul present has heard of a Celis identification number. The man at the front is still celebrating after his number was called, and then, all at once, the crowd begins to surge forward. In a heartbeat, the anxious wait explodes into a riot. Someone throws something at the doors, Mina looks terrified, and Lem completely freezes. Not only did he just watch his dream die, he's learning it was never even possible in the first place. It takes some purposeful coaxing from you and some accidental coaxing from Mina, but he follows you out. When you turn to Lem, there are tear tracks running down his cheeks, and Mina is sniffling into his jacket. They screwed you. Screwed all of you. You were never even on the list. The feeling is as unpleasant as it is familiar. Now, I know you're playing as like a pseudo-robot, but you were built to deal in salvage and mechanics. There's never a point in this game where you're some sort of action hero, but with a bit of time, a bit of subtlety, and a bit of technical know-how, you're able to get a hell of a lot done. So why not try stowing away? Not for yourself, then maybe you could at least sneak Lem and Mina on board. So you scope out the ship, see the dockyards where folks are loading the supplies onto the ship little by little, check what security measures there are, and no luck. No lacks in security, no obvious way in. Enter Castor. Most of the folks you meet throughout the Eye have a storyline attached to them, a la Lem and Mina. But Castor is an exception. While it is definitely possible that you could meet him here, odds are you're actually acquainted by now. You can originally meet him at this little table he's got set up in Lowtown. He's heard of you. And he invites you to play the favored game of local gamblers, Tavla. As you talk, he destroys you almost casually, all the while making mention that he deals in information. More specifically, data. And since sleepers can see the data floating in the very air, that's made you somebody of particular interest. Castor, being who he is, notices you skulking about the sidereal horizon, and, well, from there it's not hard to guess what you're after. So, he makes an offer. See, the reason Celis is operating out here, in the middle of nowhere, is specifically because it's so far from prying eyes. Except for Castor, of course. He wants a spy on the ship, and your nature makes you uniquely qualified, so he offers a ticket. After mentioning Lem and Mina, Castor immediately mentions that they can easily be included. Assuming you're going, of course. While you never really get to know Castor terribly well, it's as kind of an offer as it seems like he's capable of making. But it still feels like a sick joke. After you've escaped from that corporation that gave you this actively breaking body before enslaving you, and then getting fucked by Celis at the shipyard, you're supposed to surrender what's probably gonna be the rest of your life to Celis's colony? In exchange for fucking rain? Now, during your playthrough, this is a genuine choice. You can go on the horizon if you want, but in my playthrough? Well, if this choice was only for me, it would have been done in a heartbeat, but it wasn't just my ticket up for grabs here. Castor making you that offer begins the final timer on this questline. You have a set amount of time to get some data from Celis that you'll need to make fake IDs for you, Lem, and Mina. And if you want to put anyone on that ship, then you need to get it before the ship leaves. It's a pretty long timer, too. It's a lot of time to really think on what you want to do. If you're not interested in Castor's deal, then you just need to sit with your inaction for a while. And the thought that you could take one for your friends is always there. If you're in for Castor's deal, though, well, then this is it. Wrap up whatever you've got going on and knuckle down to get what you need before time runs out. I can't speak on that series of events, though. Maybe others can, or maybe you will after you've experienced it, but leaving on the horizon never seemed desirable for me. Obviously, Celis has already proved that it sucked, but what happens if it turns out they didn't do their due diligence, and you arrive on a planet full of pissed-off fauna or something? The station isn't the best place to raise a child, but the lack of a single overseeing group in power means it's a place you can shape and make your own in a way. The Eye exists because of and for the people on it. The people on Celis 1 exist to make the planet work for the company. If you simply live your life without minding the ship, then eventually the timer for it to leave fills. And Lem and Mina have just one more event. You meet Lem and Mina at the center of the Eye, where you all watch the ship leave. The game's always got a fantastic sense of atmosphere, but there's something especially somber about this scene. Not just from its context, but the microgravity at the center of the Eye lends itself to new character art with this soft blue lighting. Lem barely manages to greet you before you get the opportunity to apologize. Even though a rational mind can justify taking this man's dream away, or at least not acting to make it a reality, it was hard not to empathize with his reasons for wanting this. Lem shrugs off your apology near instantly, since that's the sort of person he is. You get the option to say you've made a mistake, and if you do so, he points out that everyone does. And at a point, the things you've done that seem like poor choices turn out to be the best decisions you've ever made, before he pointedly turns to his adoptive daughter. You ever heard of the 3-body problem? He asks as you wait for the sidereal to depart. The idea is that as soon as 3 bodies are in movement, it's impossible to predict how they'll move again. We are all bodies in space, and we can't see how that's going to work out for us. But the important thing is we are all affecting each other, right? It's not just one of us calling the shots, making the decisions, shaping the others. Each one is equal, pushes and pulls, and is pushed and pulled in turn. And maybe there are other bodies too, right? The Eye, Esther a few units down, other kids, other systems, hell, the whole Helian solar systems itself. And some of these bodies have bigger forces, bigger effects, but none of them, not one, can totally dictate the movement of the others. Staring out at what's in front of you, it's hard not to see some of what Lem's talking about in motion. The side reel and Silas are, of course, massive in the amount of influence they can exert over people's lives. What's of the people on the side reel, though? How much pull do they have against the weight of their mission or the pressure of their corporate overlords? The final thought that hits your mind before the game fades to credits is how those in the ship could so easily be ruined by what they've signed up for. Silas could, and to some extent already has, hurt them without a second thought or without any consequences of note. This scene, and in fact this line of thinking, presents the side reel as a huge mistake, but one that just so happens to have a fantastic pitch. The idea of life planetside is ultimately just taking away your power and leaving you decades away on a planet where you're destined to toil as a frontiersman in an arrangement that will probably benefit the corporation a lot more than you. In a lot of ways, it's a deeply dehumanizing agreement. On the eye, though, here you're not really bound to anyone or anything. You're just a person. A citizen, some would say. And you're subject to nothing you don't want to be subject to. Not to say that Lem and Mina can't do things to change your course. It was a choice to spend time babysitting Mina, after all, but in viewing the world around you as an interconnected web of people influencing those around them rather than largely extant entities wielding unfathomable power, one sees a community actually worth being a part of. One where drowning out any one individual is difficult, if not outright impossible. There's this real love of humanity you can see present in the way that Lem talks about communities. Like disorganization is just a beautiful part of the human experience. And he's not the only one to talk like this. At one point, you're sat down to talk to a man named Fang, who works as a systems engineer for the station. He talks similarly, with glee, about how the station works. Residents here look up at the eye and think they're seeing a constant, a concrete reality. But this place is a system in constant flux, decaying and growing, collapsing into new configurations. From a thematic perspective, this philosophy, this love of human disorder extends to everything. Instead of any singular monolithic thing, rather than the I, individual entity, proper noun, capitalized letters, Fang sees it as an ever-shifting bunch of separate things that change as people move around and change them. In this system, nobody truly owns the eye. The gangs that keep an eye on Lowtown and the unions that run the shipyards can exert a lot of authority, but never quite enough. Fang presents this sort of deeply humanized anarchy as ideal for the way a system should operate. Lem and Mina present a similar dynamic in regards to interpersonal relationships, where people can't really control others, but everyone is under the influence of those around them to some extent or another. However, the story of Ankita the Stranded Mercenary applies this same idea in a very different way. Ankita is likely met fairly early on, much like Lem and Mina, when the player is lacking in friends. So when she calls out to offer you a small amount of cash to help her unload some goods, it's easy to jump at the opportunity to meet someone. Ankita is a direct and commanding presence. She's not a particularly warm person, but there's a sense of respect one can feel from her directness. She also seems to see things very rigidly. For instance, when she asks you to do something, you may see it as a favor, but Ankita sees it as a provided service, and believes that when you do a service, you get paid. She carries this rigidity her whole story, and it's a huge problem for her, both going forward and before you've even met her. The reason her little title is the Stranded Mercenary is because when she arrived on the Eye, one of her crew cut out her ship mind. The computer core that does all the computery shit a spaceship needs. Obviously, her crew were mercenaries, and Ankita's ship wasn't going anywhere, so they all dipped to find new employment. Enter you. Ankita's ship needs some basic repairs, which are easy enough, but she also needs a new ship mind, which is still something you can replace, but not quite so easily. Once you've done that, you learn about who stole the old one. Ankita doesn't know why he did it, but she knows that the ship mind was stolen by a man named Ashton. Naturally, Ankita's pretty pissed at him on account of completely screwing her over, costing her a crew, and potentially stranding her on the Eye, but while she does have a lead on the guy, She knows that her poking her nose around would just send him running. Re-enter you. Not that she expects you to kill him, of course, but sending the pseudo-cyborg robot person seems slightly less obvious than sending the linebacker-looking mercenary, so why not? Plus, she promises to pay well. Now, you're still not an action hero, but in that last quest, you tried to stow away on a billion-dollar private company ship, so why not track a man through a forest? You'll have to spend a day or two out in the overgrown vegetation of the Greenway before you manage to find somewhere that looks like it might be where Ashton's hiding out. Before you find him, though, you stumble across the reason he stole Ankita's shipmind. At some point, Ashton fell in love with a sleeper. But seeing their decaying body, and without stabilizer in hand, he thought his best chance was to simply ditch the body and upload their consciousness into something else. Maybe a shipmind. Of course, the efficacy of that plan is very much up in the air. Ankita enters shortly after you, and the fact that she got here so fast makes it clear that she was following you. And it's not a coincidence she sent some random amateur to hunt down Ashton. You were meant to be bait. Soon after she enters, Ashton begins taking shots from afar. Maybe he heard the two of you coming and hid. But maybe he saw you trying to track him down and figured out Ankita's play. Regardless, Ankita quickly spurs into action and grabs the cords that are keeping that broken sleeper alive. She calls out for Ashton to come out, or else she'll pull the plug. He does, and he begins explaining himself. See, he knew there was no chance he'd be able to get the shipmind from Ankita just by asking for it. So he took it, since what other choice did he have? And while obviously this scene primarily explains the rationale behind his actions, it also says a lot about Ankita. She used you for bait. Her first instinct when the shooting started was to take a hostage. And also, she has nothing to gain from this encounter. This is a revenge killing. She's not a good person. Regardless, he keeps explaining himself, and as he's talking, his words start to get to Ankita. He starts walking forwards. He moves to pick up the sleeper, tells her that he's gonna take them and go. Ankita lowers her gun a tad, and he takes a chance, the best one he thinks he's probably gonna get. Gunshots fly, you hide. Eventually, those gunshots cease, and you peek out. Ashton is lying face down and is completely still in a growing red pool. The sleeper's laying there completely still, and Ankita is standing upright, holding the unplugged cords. As you take in the scene, she turns to you. She begins to say something, but no words actually come out, at least not before you turn to leave. Days pass. You work, probably get some stabilizer, maybe you've made a truce with the gross shithead who was hunting the bounty on you. Maybe you spend some time with Amos. Life generally goes on. But eventually, you try to go to bed and see that you can't while there's still a scene to play out. You make your way over to the Greenway to find Ankita holding what funeral she can with what she has. She looks like shit, and, as fits her usual manner of speaking, she makes a stiff and direct apology for what happened to that sleeper. Though her thoughts on Ashton aren't so simple. I've had crew members double-cross me, undercut me, rat me out. That's the business. He wasn't a good person. None of us in this job are. And this is how we die. Alone. That's the core of the rationale she gives, and it's a deeply pathetic excuse. Sure, once he had made his move, she didn't really have much of a choice, but he seemed right to assume she wouldn't just let him go. These two deaths wind up feeling deeply arbitrary. You've already helped her replace the shipmind at this point. She never seemed to be under the assumption that Ashton would be some kind of problem going forward. She didn't need anything from him. She hunted him down and killed him on principle. 2 people died because you don't let people who fucked you over get away with it. Not only did this whole murder not have to happen, you, the player, are actually in a very unique position to make sure that everybody walks away happy here. It may have been a bit late to help that sleeper's broken body, but we could have tried to interface with them thanks to our abilities surrounding data and such. If nothing else, I'd wager the player knows more people with expertise in this area than Ashton does. In the way that Lem and Mina's story surrounded the arbitrary and often cruel systems that comprise massive corporations and the actual labor that supports them, Ankita's story surrounds the arbitrary systems people choose to live their lives by. Not only does her arbitrary nature fuck her over here, it fucks over Ashton and that sleeper. Ankita's principles are predictable. Ashton knew about it, that's why he didn't even bother talking to Ankita before he took everything. That's why he had to lay low and couldn't find help asking around the station. That's why he takes the first chance he thinks he can get and winds up getting killed. In sticking to her principles, Ankita chose to interact with people like a checklist. If helped me, then pay for help. If screwed me over, then die. It's fundamentally lacking in basic humanity, but it's just part of her life. It's the system she's lived by for a long time. This view of systems is the core of Citizen Sleeper. Systems are arbitrary and strict. They're necessarily in conflict with the nuance and care that anything remotely complicated demands of us, whether it's interpersonal relationships, the codes of conduct one chooses to live their life by, or the entirety of a massive fucking space station. A system, to its core, should be composed of and for the wants of the people who run it. People shouldn't be forced to bend and fit themselves neatly into a system. There's also this sort of mysticism that the game uses when it talks about its love of this humanistic disorder, for lack of a better term, this beautiful aimlessness. The game's least orderly things are all spoken about with love. Lem talks about his three bodies like this perfect balance. Fang discusses the eye's multitudinous and largely independent systems working in harmony as a thing of beauty, and Ashton unambiguously states that he loves the sleeper he would eventually die for. It's inefficient and chaotic, but ultimately there's a sort of beauty to this that can't be found in something more polished. And Citizen Sleeper is full of stories like these two. Hell, this isn't actually the end of Ankita's story. It's rare that one can find a game so good at getting into your head, both with what it's saying and through its sheer vibe. It's clever, it's charming, it's relaxing, it's depressing. It's gotta be one of the most enthralling game experiences there is. Not in spite of that aimlessness, but oftentimes because of it.